So my name is Wyatt Graham. I'm joined here with Dr. Michael Haykin, who is a professor and chair of church history at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and on the core faculty at Heritage Seminary in Cambridge. I've asked him to come speak to us today about the Puritans because he spent his life studying Christian history and is a student of history, and so we're happy to have him here. So Dr. Haykin, I just wanted to kind of first ask you, can you just let us know, how did you get into studying church history? Where did that passion begin for you?
Yeah, good. It's good to be with you. I cannot remember when I didn't love church history. Well, I didn't love history. Church history came as, obviously, church history is a species or a branch of the larger field of history. And when I was very little, it was the subject that kind of gripped my mind and heart. The first teacher I ever had, a Miss Davies, in grade school, kind of kindled a love for history. And I think teachers are very, very helpful in kindling that love. And history is, generally speaking, being ill-served because of the nature, the few history courses that are often taught. History teachers usually double as something else. And usually that other subject is, well, my experience has been is more often their interest and their concern, and history gets shafted to some degree. So, but that has not been my experience, my own personal experience. I'm very thankful for various individuals who are very early on in my life loved history and conveyed that love to me.
Well, that's good. I think I began to get into history. It's interesting, after I became a Christian, a little bit of a different story. And then it became something that was thrilling and interesting, especially church history, to kind of see, I suppose, roots or the theology and all that kind of stuff. Now,
yeah, that's probably more typical. I find, especially among younger men, that it's not until they're in their 20s and 30s even that kind of a realization of the importance of history is awakened. And often it's becoming a Christian that they suddenly realize, oh, I really do need to know roots and where we've come from and so on.
Yeah, I've actually thought about this a little bit, that one of the, sometimes you wonder, what's the difference between being a Christian and not a Christian? One thing in my life was, before I was a Christian, I barely read books. But then after I became a Christian, not because I love books, but I read so many because I was so curious to know more, whether that's the Bible or books about the Bible. And I think you kind of get hooked. I think it's Richard Bauckham who calls Christianity a bookish religion. And there's something to that.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to kind of get into the topic of the Puritans. And I'm kind of excited to hear more. Myself, I have a very basic knowledge of the Puritans. In college, I read, the Puritan paperback, some of those. I read a Wikipedia article on Puritans, so I'm very well researched, obviously, which is a joke. But I think a lot of people are like me. They appreciate aspects of the Puritans. They maybe have read a book or two. They've heard of Richard Baxter. Maybe they've read a Bruised Reed. But we don't really know who they are historically, what their concerns are, what their theological emphases were. So I kind of wanted just to kind of hear from you as a church historian a little bit more about the Puritans. So maybe the first question I want to ask is just, who are the Puritans in general? How would you describe them?
Yeah, the Puritans are a reform movement within the Church of England. The Church of England established in the 1530s as part of the Reformation. And during the 1550s, the monarch, Mary I, sometimes known as Bloody Mary, attempted to take the church back into the Church of Rome. That failed, but she martyred about 300 or so Protestants in England, but 1,000 fled to the continent. And upon her death in 1558 and the accession of Elizabeth I, they returned. And they had spent most of the time enjoying the hospitality of various Reformed communities as opposed to Lutheran. And that gave them a distinct vision of the Christian life, particularly that in worship, nothing was to be done in worship but what was explicitly commanded or could be deduced by command from the Word of God. And Elizabeth I was Calvinistic as they were theologically, but she was quite happy to allow various elements of what had been part of the medieval worship experience to continue in the Church of England. And she was also committed to Episcopal Church government, which became an issue. And in the early 1560s, you start to get this movement, which we call Puritanism. That is a term that first appears around 1564, beginning initially wanting a wholesale reform of worship, areas of worship like the use of rings in the wedding service. There's nothing biblical. The Puritans argued about that. In fact, wedding rings come from Anglo-Saxon Germanic paganism. And kneeling at the Lord's Supper, the use of readings from the Apocrypha in the course of the lectionary readings for the Christian calendar. And so there was a number of areas that the Puritans protested. Those protests went nowhere in the sense of they were not listened to by the authorities, and the issue of authority came up. So the initial conflict is over worship. The second area is over who has the right to determine what goes on in the church in terms of worship. And Elizabeth regarded herself as the head of the church. It was a title that she had inherited. Ultimately, it went back to her father, Henry VIII. And she was quite convinced that she would have to give an account to God for how she led the church. And she did not want to decentralize that authority, which was really kind of focused on her and the bishops. It was an Episcopal church government. The Puritans increasingly became Presbyterian. The locus of authority in the life of the local church was the elders, and they wanted elder rule. Once the Puritans raised that issue in the 1570s, it wasn't long before some Puritans moved towards a Congregationalist position, and that is they wanted to dissolve the entire medieval parish church structure and admit to the membership of churches only those who could give a testimony of conversion. So Puritanism then begins as a movement of reform over issues of worship. It soon becomes a larger movement that details issues of authority in the local church. And that initiates really a search for a blueprint in the New Testament for both worship and church governance.
So one of the things that's interesting to me is you have the different types of Puritans as well, because you have the Congregational, Presbyterian, and you even have some Episcopal Presbyterian or Puritans, correct?
You do, yes. So as late as the 1640s, you have a man like James Ussher.
Okay.
Who was the Bishop of Armagh, Anglo-Irish bishop. And he was definitely committed to the Episcopal Church government, but theologically would be Puritan.
Interesting. And yeah, just out of curiosity, one of the authors I really enjoy reading is Richard Hooker. He'd be 16th century. Would he be a Puritan, or would he be more Church of England? So what distinguishes him from them? Just the idea that he's more open to continuity?
The whole issue of Episcopal Church government.
Episcopal Church government, okay.
And then also his attitudes to worship would not have been those of the Puritans.
Okay, interesting. So the Puritans then eventually... they eventually kind of have to leave the Church of England, it seems like, but they do have a time where they're able to
there are some by the 1590s who become convinced that the Church of England is never going to be fully reformed, and they do begin to set up independent congregations. They're Congregationalists, and they become known as separatists.
Okay.
And it is out of those groups that you start to you get the emergence of Baptists in the first decade of the 17th century.
Interesting.
The vast majority of Puritans, though, stay within the Church of England, and people like Richard Sibbes, who dies in 1635, are convinced that eventually they'll be able to reform the Church of England. The Puritans end up in a civil war with the monarch and Parliament against the monarch. And in the 1640s, everything just breaks open. There is a complete total relaxation of parish discipline in one sense. There is civil war, and you get the emergence of a host of sects. People like the Muggletonians, the Levelers, the Diggers, the Ranters, the Grindletonians, and more famously, the Quakers. And also among that would be the particular Baptists, the Calvinistic Baptists. And a significant number of Puritans do leave the Church of England in the 1640s, 1650s. And then with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, a series of laws are enacted beginning in 1661, running through to 1673, known as the Clarendon Code, named after the initial framer of some of the laws. And these laws are deeply repressive. And the Puritans, the critical one is the act passed on August the 24th, 1662, the Act of Uniformity, that requires worship in the Church of England to be conducted by an ordained Anglican minister, ordained properly by a bishop, and according to the Book of Common Prayer, without leaving any of it out and without adding anything.
Interesting.
And 2,000 ministers are expelled from England.
So during this early 1600s, how connected are the Puritans with the European churches? I know they were in the 16th century, like you noted, but in the 17th century, is there a change in the relationship? In other words, are they involved with the Synod of Dort? Are they involved with Geneva? Like, what's that relationship look like?
They're very close connections. And so the Puritan wing of the Church of England, and it's large, it's about a third of the Puritan wing of Church of England ministers. They are very strongly connected to Reformed churches on the continent, see themselves as part of a larger Calvinist international. And there were Puritan figures at the Synod of Dort, 1618, 1619, and a number of Puritans during hotter times of persecution would end up finding themselves, particularly in Holland.
Interesting. Now, this is a bit of just another personal curiosity. John Davenant, would he be considered in the Puritan movement, or is he Church of England more straight up?
He would not probably. He's not normally considered as part of the larger Puritan movement. No.
Okay. I know he had a pretty tight connection with Holland. I think the School of Utrecht as well, if memory serves. Maybe that's wrong. But I was just kind of curious. You have these figures that pop up, and sometimes it's hard to identify how they relate to these broader movements.
Yep.
So 1660, Charles II reinstated monarchy. The Puritans, therefore, have lost their sort of power base in England, I suppose. What happens to them next?
Well, not exactly, but this legislation basically destroys their connections to the military, the Army, Navy, destroys their connections to higher education, the two universities in Oxford and Cambridge, prevents them from occupying political office, and even down to things like eventually laws are passed that prevent Puritans being buried in parish cemeteries. Now, there are various Anglican ministers who don't follow that, but the Anglican minister is well within his rights to refuse to bury a Puritan figure in the community, and even marriage. So legal marriages can only be performed by Anglican ministers, which means that if you're a Puritan outside the Church of England, nonetheless, and you get married, you still need to go to the local Anglican minister to get married.
Interesting. So they get cut off from the university education. Presumably, they start their own.
They do. They start their own small academies, some of which are excellent. And in fact, some of the cutting edge research and writing and reflection is being carried on in these small academies. Not only theology, but also the whole range of liberal arts and science. So a good example is Joseph Priestley in the 18th century, basically raised Presbyterian. I mean, he's involved in a number of these academies and is on the cutting edge of the discovery of various gases, oxygen, etc. And that is illustrative of the fact that despite the fact that they do not have access to the two major universities in England, they can nonetheless put together a fairly good education in some of these academies.
In some of the academies. Now, there was a subgroup that were Baptistic. Were they involved in the academy as well, or was there a bit of a...
Yeah, those, the General Baptist, there are two Baptist groups. The first is the ones that emerged from the Separatists. And they're associated with a man named John Smith, who was a Separatist, persecuted in England. He and his entire congregation moved to Holland, to Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, he begins to raise the question, which nobody really wanted to raise. If the Church of England, as the Separatists argued, this kind of Congregationalist wing of Puritanism that broke with the Church of England before the Puritans were kicked out en masse, if the Church of England, as they argued, is not a true church, can they still administer the ordinances? So it's the whole question of the Donatists that gets raised. And Smith argues, no, if the Church of England is a false church, her baptism must also be false. And he becomes convinced as he studies scripture that only believers should be baptized. And the problem is he doesn't know of a proper administrator. And so he subsequently baptizes himself, which raises a huge brouhaha, understandably, and baptizes the rest of the members of his congregation. So that's your first emergence of Baptists. The other group comes out of what we would describe as a semi-separatist church, a church that still maintains ties with the Church of England, and yet has become an independent Congregationalist community in the heart of London. And it's often known by the names of its first three pastors, the JLJ Church, Henry Jacob, John Lathrop, Henry Jesse. And in the 1630s, a number of people within that community begin to raise the same sort of questions that John Smith did about the legitimacy of a baptism given in the Church of England. And eventually you get about 4 or 5 separate groups that separate from that church, start their own communities, and they will be known as particular Baptists or Calvinistic Baptists.
You know, it's interesting. Sometimes you hear criticisms about Baptist churches splitting today. It does kind of sound like, for what you just described, that's not a new phenomenon. There was a number of groups that splintered off even at the very get-go.
Yeah, although the divisions that emerge are different. The John Smith group, the divisions are fairly vitriolic. Smith regards himself and his Baptists as the only true churches. So the Separatists are wrong, and they're not true churches. The Church of England is definitely wrong. The Puritans within the Church of England are wrong. So it's a very, very negative, narrow-minded vision that the General Baptists inherit, and it plagues them. The particular Baptists, though, leave the Jacob Lathrop Jesse Church on very good terms. And it's particularly during the ministry of Henry Jesse, who is a deeply ironic individual. And he gives his blessing to these various groups that leave. And so these groups maintain a warm relationship with their mother church. So it's quite different from the origins of the General Baptists. And that's important because that'll shape early particular Baptist history.
Interesting. So at the end of the 17th century, you have various different groups. Some separate, some try to stay close to the Church of England, some stay in the Church of England, and a lot of people cross
by after 1662, there really is no Puritan party within the Church of England.
Okay, so that's 1662.
There are a few men like William Gurnell who do what was called conform. They conform to the demands to worship according to the Book of Common Prayer. He's a Puritan, but that's very, very, very few.
So some stay in England, some go to the continent, but many also come to North America, correct?
Yes, the ones that initially go to the continent, like the separatists, and one of the key leaders there is John Robinson, who is a colleague initially of John Smith, and then an opponent when Smith baptizes himself. They have problems in the first 2 decades of the 17th century because they're now having children, and those children are speaking Dutch and becoming Dutch. And the Puritans don't have problems with Dutch culture per se in one sense, but they realize they're losing their own culture. And because the New World was being opened up to exploration and settlement, they make the decision to cross in 1620.
Interesting.
So, 400 years ago than this year, and land in what is now Massachusetts, Plymouth, in November of 1620. And that basically initiates a wave, well, not a wave, but waves of immigration through the 1620s, 1630s, 1640s, where significant numbers of men and women, despairing of religious liberty in England, seek it in a new world.
Interesting. So, okay, it's interesting. Now, when they come to North America, yes, we have, at least as North Americans, a bit of a stereotype about Puritans in North America. And so we can use the term puritanical. And what that means to us, I think, is that someone is against pleasure, against fun. Why do they have that reputation, and is it true?
Yes, when the Puritans are basically expelled from the Church of England, the Church of England begins a long campaign, which is actually quite successful. Through the legislation, it's got two wings or two foci. The legislation prevents Puritan access to any sort of power, be it political power, be it military power, be it the power that comes through education. The other wing is this campaign to destroy the name of Puritan, and so the term puritanical becomes a byword for something that, as you said, hates pleasure, is narrow, rigid, bigoted, legalistic, and so on. And the way in which that word Puritan, puritanical, puritanic becomes a byword for a rigid, narrow-minded bigot is afraid that there's somebody in the world enjoying themselves, and they're determined to stop them. That's pretty successful. And it's interesting, in the 1940s when C.S. Lewis wrote the Screwtape Letters, which is that very ingenious book written from the vantage point of our enemy. Screwtape, the senior figure in the book, writes to his nephew Wormwood and says that one of the great achievements that they've had, one of the great victories they've had, is what they've done with the word Puritan and puritanical. And he says, by that word, we have redeemed hundreds of thousands every year. And by that, he means, obviously, because he's the point of view of the enemy, is that people's desire to avoid being described as puritanical has meant that they have plunged into a world of hedonism. I remember reading in the 1980s of a debate that took place in Lubbock, Texas, between a Christian author and apologist, and I forget who it was, and a representative of the philosophy of Playboy. And in the debate, at one point, the philosophy of Playboy used the term puritanical of his debater, of his counterpart in the debate. And the Christian said, no, we can't stand being puritanical either. and failing to recognize that the Puritans would have been the closest people in the 17th century to this man's theological position. And in fact, the Puritans, the term is not true. If anybody kind of fits that term, it's the Victorians, I think. But the Puritans are deeply committed to the fact that the Christian life is a life of joy and enjoyment. People like Oliver Cromwell had his daughter take dancing lessons. John Owen once was seen crossing a quad in Oxford with his brilliant yellow cloak and orange leather boots. It's kind of a color clash, but it gives you a very different picture than what it's become down to us regarding the Puritans. If anybody that fits that model, it would be the Quakers, who tended to dress in various drab colors like brown, gray, black, etc.
Now, when they're in North America, one thing that I saw was they had a unique, they had many children, and there was a giant kind of population boom in North America. And that's one of the reasons why Puritanism kind of took off in the, I guess, Massachusetts area. Is that kind of an accurate way to put it, or is there more to the story?
Yeah, I'm not so sure I would say that it was primarily because of the large numbers of children. A lot of the Puritans, like, say, Cotton Mather in Boston, a leading figure, he had 15 children, but he buried 13 of them under the age of 3. Philip Doddridge had about 16, 17 children. Now, he's at the very tail end of Puritanism. I'm not sure I would even describe him as a Puritan, but he had a similar number of children and, again, buried most of them. John Owen had, I think Owen had about 12 or 13. Only one reached their adulthood. So they did have large families, but most of the children died. So in Jonathan Edwards, for instance, his parents, who are Puritans, Timothy and Esther Edwards, they had 11 children, 10 girls and Jonathan, and they all survived into adulthood. That was very, very unusual.
Interesting.
So, but initially there are these waves of emigration. The large numbers of children surviving infancy doesn't really start. You don't see that tip until the mid 1800s, long after Puritanism, as a historical phenomenon.
I'd be curious, do you think that changed? I mean, if you live in a family with 12 kids and you're the only sibling who survives, what kind of effect do you think that had on their theological and practical Christian life? I have to think, compared to how it works today in North America, there'd be a pretty massive different vision of what it means to die, what it means to live, and what that looks like.
Yeah, it means that death is a constant, it's a constant element. It means that childbirth and the raising of children can be a very deeply traumatic experience. And for those who do survive, there is going to be a deep sense, for many of them anyway, given the theological vision of Puritanism, a deep sense of God's election, and care, and so on. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that certainly would shape. Excuse me, would shape the way that they kind of interacted with their world.
Well, it just reminds me. I believe it's Athanasius who writes, one of the ways that Christians are unique is they're not afraid of death, and it was a kind of I think it was him anyways. As a key mark of how he was able to distinguish himself against others. And it seems interesting to me that when you live in a society where mortality is so high all the time, that has to change how you think about your faith in the day-to-day. I'd be curious.
Of course, this is true also for their opponents, the Anglicans. They would also have similar mortality rates in terms of the young.
I'd be curious too, like, do you think their fight with, or their disagreement with the Church of England and their push for Presbyterian polity and all that kind of stuff, is that influence, like, does that carry over in North America? Do they keep some of that culture, that kind of maybe edged of independence through that process? or does that kind of get worn thin?
No, I mean the churches that come to New England, because the initial waves are Congregationalists and not Presbyterians.
Hmm.
So the initial group are separatists. They set up the colony in Plymouth Rock. And then later waves are non-separating Congregationalists. You've got the ones who separate clearly, distinctly, regard the Church of England as really the Antichrist or the daughter of the Antichrist. And then you have other Congregationalists who come, more like the Jacob Lathrop Jesse Church, who are willing to work with Puritans within the Church of England. But the vision of New England is really a Congregationalist vision. And that commitment to Congregationalism is pretty strong. And it will shape, obviously, I think, down the road, kind of political attitudes of independence and critiquing authorities over in England. And so to some degree, I think Puritan Congregationalism in New England is a factor that leads to the revolution.
That's really interesting. It makes a lot of sense too. I'd be curious, just from a historical perspective, if these separatists would have stayed in the Church of England, if they would have all stayed together and tried to reform together, do you think they could have made the change that they wanted, or some of the changes? Or was it just a forlorn cause that they had to leave?
Well, the problem that, and this is wrapped up with the divine right of kings, it's not simply issues of worship praxis and governance praxis within the Church of England, but it's also bound up with the determination of the kings to maintain an absolutist government. And in the late 16th and throughout the 17th century, monarchies in Europe are moving in an absolutist direction. So you get the classic model here is France. So that the monarchs of France in the late 16th and early 17th century have a lot more power than medieval monarchs, who are dependent upon their power base for the aristocracy. And England is treading the same pathway. And James the First, well, Elizabeth the First, James the First, Charles the First, all are committed to the divine right of kings, and they do not want to allow the Puritans significant control in the Church of England, because it will ultimately undermine their control. And the Puritan vision basically is that the as Presbyterians or Congregationalists, the locus of authority in the church is not the monarch, but either the elders or the congregation.
That almost, in my mind, seems to explain why, like when I think of Baptists, I think separation of church and state is one of the key factors of what makes someone a traditional Baptist. I'm not sure if that's historically true, but just when I understand it today. And what you're explaining sort of fits into that narrative, that background anyways. So I'm actually kind of curious on the question of ongoing influence, and maybe I'll ask you a more specific question. One thing I've noticed...
Baptists are...
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say Baptists are at the political end of the far left of the political spectrum, and so they're really radical because they're breaking with the parish system. They're affirming a congregational church government, which is really the genesis of democratic movements. So the Puritans are really, if you look at their demands and their desires, say during the civil wars in England in the 1640s, 1650s, they really want religious freedom, and they see this as a natural right. The language they use is very similar to the sort of language that emerges in Republican thinking among English-speaking peoples in the transatlantic world in the 18th century.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, I kind of have a more specific question. I'm just curious. One thing I've noticed, and this is true today, so I'm not sure about the past, is we, in our circles anyways, evangelical, Reformed, Baptistic circles, we seem to really value John Owen. We seem to privilege his idea of justice, his theology of justice. How did John Owen become so influential, or is that just an accident of history? Just
Well,
Curious.
I don't think it's an accident of history. I think Owen represents, an apex of Puritan reflection and Puritan theology. He's very conversant with Reformed scholasticism on the continent. He comes after 100 years of Puritan theologizing. Well, close to 80 years, I guess, 1560s to the 1640s. He starts writing in the 1640s. And he is a brilliant theologian. It certainly helps that his works are reprinted or published as a collection in the 1850s. And then when the Banner of Truth in the 1950s begins to reprint Puritan literature, his works are the first that they decide to reprint. They don't reprint, for instance, Thomas Goodwin, his theological counterpart, also a Congregationalist. So there are probably some reasons like that, print history, but his reputation is well deserved. It's not the case that, other greater Puritans have been left in obscurity because of decisions regarding who to reprint. He is a great theologian, but it was aided, especially in the recent days, it's been aided by the kind of distribution of vast number of sets of John Owen's works.
Interesting. So now thinking back, so we're the 21st century church, looking back on the Puritans, what are some of the things that you think we can learn from them that are very valuable? And maybe what are some of the things that perhaps they did wrong that we could avoid or learn from? Like, how could you kind of maybe judge them from a 21st century perspective? Maybe judge too strong of a word, but you get what I mean. How can we learn from them?
Yeah, I think their commitment to, number one, the scriptures is exemplary. They have a deep commitment to the Word of God as the standard for worship and doctrine. I think that's vital, especially in our day. Secondly, there really are, the Puritanism is really a movement of spirituality. One of the debates about what is a Puritan, for example, from a historical vantage point, has really Puritanism ending in 1662, and the argument being that once the Puritans are kicked out of the Church of England, they lose their raison d'etre as a movement. They're a reform movement within the Church of England, and they can't do that once they're outside of it. And I think that takes too narrow a view of what Puritanism is. Puritanism is first and foremost a spirituality. It's not primarily a movement that's concerned about politics or even about worship. And definitely it's not, you can't identify Puritanism with Calvinism because many of their opponents in the early days, up until the 1620s, so the first 60 years of the battle of Puritanism within the Church of England is against men and women who are equally Calvinistic. And so Puritanism as a movement, it will become identified with Calvinism after the 1620s and 1630s, but in its initial years, it doesn't. So what is the continuity? The continuity is a spirituality. It's a heart religion and a hunger for revival. And so those areas there, and it's a Christ-centered, Bible-based spirituality. What did they do wrong? I think the conviction that there's a blueprint in Scripture for church governance. All of the early Puritan groups that survive, Presbyterian, Congregationalist, Baptist, and even the Quakers, who are kind of a spin-off, many of the Quakers started life, as it were, as Puritans or in Puritan homes and gravitate. They go further and further left. They start as Presbyterians, become Congregationalists. Some of them end up Baptists before becoming Quakers. So even Quakerism is a kind of an element of the Puritan movement in some ways. The Puritans wouldn't have recognized that, though, by the way. They would have regarded the Quakers as completely outside the pale. All of them think that there's a blueprint in Scripture that can actually find a pattern of church governance. And the fact that after basically 100 years, Puritanism emerges 1563. That's the first time the word Puritanism used as a term. And then 1662 kicked out of the Church of England, and they still continue, though, obviously, with their ethos for another 40, 50 years. And all that time, despite their divisions, they think they're convinced that somebody can find an exact blueprint on how to do church.
Mm.
And I think their failure is that there isn't the exact blueprint that they want. That the New Testament admits of both a Congregationalist model, but also Presbyterianism has a strong, I mean, I'm a Congregationalist, and I am for certain reasons, but I'm conscious that those who are Presbyterians, I'm not talking here that the infant baptism, Baptistic
Sure.
perspectives. I'm talking here about governance. Those arguments are, Presbyterians can make very strong arguments for elder rule out of the New Testament. So, and I don't think the New Testament gives us an exact blueprint.
No, that makes a lot of sense. In fact, if memory serves, I think that's Richard Hooker's argument for why he thinks the Church of England has a valid church governance. It's for that precise reason. Although he might go further than you would, and you might have qualifications, I'm sure. Thanks for all of this. It's helpful. I'm sure that some people will be curious to know how to get into understanding the Puritans and reading them. They're in English, which is nice, although some of the English is hard to read. If you were going to recommend to someone who's interested in reading the Puritans to read them, where would they start?
There's probably a number of authors. Richard Greenham, Greenham. His works aren't easy to find, but he might be a figure. He's an early Puritan, dies in the 1590s. Richard Sibbes is just a great way into Puritanism. Bruce Reed, reprinted by the Banner of Truth. Sibbes dies in 1635. He's at the tail end of the, he's before the Civil Wars and the kind of bitterness between the Puritan Parliament and the Anglican episcopacy that defends the king. John Owen. John Owen's Mortification of Sin in Believers. His work on the glory of Christ. Those are tremendous. His 2 volumes in the reprint, anyway, on the Holy Spirit, volumes 3 and 4 in the works of John Owen, Banner of Truth. He again would be fabulous. Even in this most recent, kind of crisis we're in, this pandemic, an author like James Janaway, who during not a similar, but a pandemic of the plague in London in 1665, Heaven on Earth, a great little book. So there's a lot of Puritan literature. John Bunyan, a number of his works are tremendous. I mean, his Pilgrim's Progress is the best-selling book in the English language after the Bible. And so there are a number of kind of primary sources. Secondary sources, J.I. Packer's Quest for Godliness. It's a great set of essays by really a master of Puritan history. Martin Lloyd-Jones, the Puritans, would be also a man who was not a trained historian, but nonetheless had a deep appreciation of history. And then finally, Leland Ryken, Worldly Saints, which if any book kind of dismisses the idea that the Puritans were against pleasure, it would be that book. He looks at Puritan culture, which is very helpful. Puritan families, Puritans in the larger social realm, and it's really a tremendous kind of study on Puritan social history.
Great. Well, thanks, Dr. Haykin. That was really helpful. I think I learned a lot about the Puritans, I'm sure. I'll have to re-listen to it, and I'm sure many others will through this. So thank you for being here and for talking to me.
Thank you very much.